The occupiers are bogged down in battles for Pokrovsk and are unable to capture the city by force of arms. This was stated by the 7th Corps of the Rapid Response Air Assault Forces on their Telegram channel. It is noted that as a result, the enemy is trying to intensify propaganda and disinformation, manipulating fabrications about the alleged capture of Pokrovsk both openly and covertly. The statement also says,
"The situation in our area of responsibility remains difficult. The enemy is actively assaulting the northern part of Pokrovsk. Our soldiers continue to carry out their tasks defending the city, holding back the advance of the Russians."
The 7th Air Assault Corps adds, "In certain areas, the enemy is trying to operate near logistical routes, but in these zones, the rate at which the enemy is eliminated is higher than the rate of their movement." It is also noted that despite the intense fighting over the past week, the Defense Forces grouping in the area of Mirnohrad has carried out several personnel rotations. It should be noted that on December 2nd, Russia claimed to have allegedly captured Pokrovsk and Vovchansk. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine refuted these statements.
The triumphant statements by the leadership of the aggressor country about the capture of these settlements by the Russian army do not correspond to reality. This is merely another attempt by the Kremlin to use a filmed flag planting for propaganda purposes to influence participants in international negotiations.
The agency noted that in Pokrovsk, Donetsk region, the defense forces are holding the northern part of the city along the railway line. Search and assault operations to eliminate enemy pockets are ongoing, and the enemy is suffering significant losses. Meanwhile, in Vovchansk, the enemy continues its attempts to advance, using small infantry groups, attack UAVs, and artillery. However, Ukrainian defenders are steadfastly holding their positions. Meanwhile, Russian troops tried to break through the front in the Zaporizhzhia region and occupy Huliaipole, but all enemy attempts have failed. This was stated on December 3rd by the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation, Andriy Kovalenko, on his Telegram channel.
The Russians are unable to break through the front, although the fighting continues and is indeed very intense.
Kovalenko noted that Russia's goal remains unchanged, the destruction of the Ukrainian state. But they will not succeed. The Ukrainian armed forces also debunked the Russian fake about an alleged breakthrough in Lyman, Donetsk region. This was stated by the commander of the 3rd Army Corps, Andriy Biletsky.
The Corps units repel about 40 enemy assaults per day on the approaches to Lyman and do not allow the enemy to enter the city.
According to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, as of 8 o'clock in the morning on December 4th, there had been 170 combat engagements recorded on the front. The Pokrovsk direction remains the most active. There, Ukrainian defenders stopped 45 assault actions by the aggressor. The Russian invaders' losses over the past day amounted to 1,140 personnel. Ukrainian forces also neutralized 3 tanks, 3 armored combat vehicles, 29 artillery systems, 1 multiple rocket launcher system, and 245 UAVs.
Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine Rustem Umerov and Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine Andriy Hanatov have flown to the United States for talks with the American delegation, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron, during a meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, proposed supporting the establishment of a moratorium on Russian strikes against Ukrainian energy infrastructure.
We must join forces to achieve at least a ceasefire as soon as possible, in the form of a moratorium on strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure during the winter.
Macron hopes that Xi Jinping will join this initiative and work together with Europe to maintain stability and protect international law.
The Russian-Ukrainian war poses a threat to European security. We call on Beijing to use its influence on Moscow to help achieve a lasting peace in Ukraine, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations.
At the same time, the Chinese leader emphasized that his country supports all efforts aimed at ending the war in Ukraine.
China consistently supports any and all constructive efforts aimed at genuinely achieving peace and sincerely hopes that all involved parties to the ongoing conflict, through comprehensive dialogue and extensive negotiations, will ultimately reach a truly fair, enduring, legally binding, and mutually acceptable peace agreement that benefits everyone involved.
Earlier, Spiegel reported that the leaders of European countries are expressing distrust toward the peace initiatives of the United States. In particular, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz believe that there is a risk of betrayal of Ukraine and Europe.
The European Commission is seeking alternative sources of liquidity to provide Ukraine with a reparations loan in case the frozen assets have to be returned to the Central Bank of Russia. This was stated by the European Commission's chief spokesperson, Paula Pinho, against the backdrop of the European Central Bank's refusal to provide funds for payments to Ukraine.
Ensuring the necessary liquidity for potential obligations to return assets to the Russian Central Bank in this case is an important element of the reparations loan. This is a mandatory condition to ensure that the EU, its member states, and private entities can always fulfill their international obligations.
The day before, the European Central Bank refused to provide guarantees for a reparations loan to Ukraine in the amount of 140 billion euros, which was supposed to be secured by frozen Russian assets. According to the Financial Times, this decision is based on the conclusion that the European Commission's proposal goes beyond the bank's mandate. It is noted that EU countries must provide state guarantees in order to distribute the risk of repayment of the reparations loan. However, according to representatives of the European Commission, member states will not be able to quickly raise the necessary funds. Belgium is opposed to using frozen Russian assets for a loan to Ukraine. As Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever stated, the scheme of providing Ukraine with reparations loans using frozen Russian assets is fundamentally flawed from the outset. According to him, the EU's plan to use frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine could jeopardize the chances of reaching a potential peace agreement. The Belgian Prime Minister stated,
"With this proposal, we would not only violate a fundamental principle of international law, but also further create uncertainty and fear in international financial markets, where trust is a key element."
EU diplomats believe that Belgium may be profiting from Russian assets. According to Politico, European Union countries are putting increasing pressure on Belgium, demanding an explanation of what it is doing with the tax revenues. According to the publication, 5 diplomats from different European countries have complained that Belgium has a hidden motivation since these assets generate tax income. Belgium itself insists that it is not violating any rules. Diplomats warn that if Belgium continues to block the transfer of frozen funds to Ukraine, by the time of the EU summit, more and more countries will be questioning whether Belgium is profiting from these taxes and delaying payments to Kiev. Earlier, Politico reported that the US allegedly wants to return Russia's frozen assets after a peace agreement. At the same time, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen continued to promote the idea of using these assets to finance Ukraine. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz holds the same opinion. He supported the European Commission's proposal to continue holding Russian funds and emphasized that it fully complies with EU international law. According to him, the assets of the Russian Central Bank will remain frozen until Russia compensates Ukraine for the damage caused by the war.
A Red Wings passenger plane flying from Moscow to Phuket made an emergency landing due to changes in the operating parameters of one of its engines.
Takeoff, there was a strong smell of kerosene. I don't know if that's a standard situation or not. Personally, I fell asleep half an hour after we took off. After that, the captain reported that there had been technical malfunctions on the plane, and we were returning to Moscow.
Emergency services, they report that one of the engines caught fire. There were 425 people on board the plane, 13 crew members and 415 passengers, according to Rosaviatia. It landed at Domodedovo Airport. On November 15th, a video appeared online showing that a Russia Airlines airliner had its engine cowling torn off on one of the engines. The plane, which had 90 passengers on board, was flying from Vladivostok to Blagoveshchensk. The plane had to make an emergency landing in Khabarovsk. The detached parts of the engine cowling were found on the runways in 2 cities at once, at both the departure and arrival airports. And on November 18th, an incident occurred with a Boeing flying from Moscow to Tajikistan. When landing, the plane's brakes failed. It almost rolled off the runway. Also this year, there have already been 2 accidents and 2 air disasters in commercial aviation. 53 people died. The largest accident was the crash of an Angara Airlines plane. News about incidents involving Russian airline planes appears frequently. From January to November 2024 alone, there were at least 210 incidents. As of November 27, 2025, according to the Telegram channel AV-Incident, various malfunctions and technical issues with Russian aircraft occurred about 4 times more often. More than 800 cases of malfunctions were recorded in which a flight was interrupted or delayed. Most of these were due to engine failure to start or doors opening. After Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, strict sanctions were imposed on the Russian aviation industry. Major Russian airlines were left without spare parts and proper technical maintenance. Overall, airlines have to save on spare parts and sometimes resort to so-called aircraft cannibalization. This is when individual aircraft are dismantled for parts to keep the rest of the fleet operational, or non-original spare parts are used instead. There are serious problems with spare parts production in Russia. They simply aren't being made yet, as reported by the head of Rosaviatsia, Dmitry Yadrov.
It's a very complicated issue. There are things that directly affect flight safety, and from a design perspective, they simply can't be implemented. We understand that at this moment, it's impossible to produce the hot section of a foreign-made engine. If it were possible, the Chinese would have already copied all the engines.
It is known that in September 2025, the Russian authorities appealed to the International Civil Aviation Organization with a request to ease sanctions on the supply of aircraft spare parts, as reported by Reuters. It was noted that the lack of spare parts negatively affects safety, including that of civil transportation. However, the sanctions are still in effect. Today, the fleet of 76 Russian companies consists of 1,135 aircraft. 1,088 aircraft are currently in operation. 48 planes are not being used, Yadrov stated. Interestingly, 2 years ago, the Ministry of Transport reported that carriers' fleets included 1,300 aircraft. At that time, 1,167 planes were in operation. The number of aircraft is decreasing, and this process cannot be stopped. According to a pessimistic forecast, by 2030 it is expected that about 340 more planes will also be withdrawn from service in the Russian Federation.